Echo Creek's Prince. The small town called Echo Creek hadn't gotten a new resident in over 20 years. When I moved in and proceeded to successfully woo its most attractive, sought-after, and intimidating bachelor. In a little over 4 months. Not bad, huh? Well, let's start from the beginning. Moving into the house my deceased uncle had left me in his inheritance, in a small town I knew little to nothing about, probably seemed like a decision made in a hurry. In fact, I knew it was. What I'd learned in my years of being a businessman was that sometimes the hastiest decisions were the best ones. I, 32 at the time, had just finished the messy process of divorcing my ex-wife, Jimmo. Sweet as she had been, when I met her during a trip to Milan, it had become clear she was not fit to be a mother to our 7-year-old daughter, Iris. After the divorce, I decided Iris and I needed a change of pace. I decided we needed to start fresh and settle down instead of traveling from place to place. Iris had never been able to make proper friends. And so, when I learned of the house my late uncle had left me in that town, I saw it as a sign. 4 months later. Our first week in our new home involved a lot of cleaning. The house was lovely and even more spacious than I had expected it to be, but it had also been abandoned for over 5 years. The first thing we both noticed when we stepped inside was a layer of dust covering everything. Iris had sneezed several times, her little nose scrunching up. I got to dusting. I gave Iris a mask and she helped me out by cleaning out the stair railings and coffee tables with a little cloth. Echo Creek looked and felt like a place that modernization had just barely managed to creep into. It was quiet, serene, surrounded by woods and a running creek that you could practically hear at all times. Hence its name. There was only one grade school, middle school, and high school that all the kids in the area attended, which I thought was just perfect. I looked over at Iris, who was mumbling to herself as she diligently wiped the dust off the arm of the sofa. She was a sweet kid, but she was getting too comfortable being alone. There was no hope of a younger sibling coming anytime soon, so I needed to fix that, pronto. I also needed to start getting to know the people in this town. How would a place like this react to 2 random newcomers? Well, no better place to start than our closest neighbors. That evening, Iris and I got ourselves fixed up and decided to pay the house next to ours a visit. A middle-aged woman opened the front door with a puzzled look on her face. I spotted 2 little boys watching us from the living room window. They ran off giggling as soon as I made eye contact with them. Frederick, I introduced myself with a charming smile. Frederick Manson. Oh, she stared at me in surprise. As in, that Frederick Manson? I think I saw you online the other day. Ah, she recognized me. I wasn't sure if that was a good or bad thing. Yep, that's me, and this is my daughter, Iris. I looked down at Iris, gently nudging her forward. Say hello, sweetness. Iris peeked up at the older woman, shy. It's nice to meet you, ma'am, she said. Her voice was quiet. This effectively charmed our neighbor. She seemed a little hesitant to let me in, but how could you turn away a face as sweet as Iris? Introducing herself as Ethel Thomas, she stepped aside for the both of us to enter and chat for a bit. Ethel told me that my uncle had lived in that house for over 25 years with his wife, before she passed away. I had no cousins, so it had just been the 2 of them. She also told me that Echo Creek had not had new residents since my uncle and aunt had moved near the turn of the millennium. This made it very clear to me that fitting in might be a little more difficult than I thought it would be. I was an intruder in what was evidently a really close-knit community. This became more obvious as the days passed and I interacted with more people in the town. They were friendly enough, but I could always get the sense that I didn't quite belong. I would get strange looks when I went around town, like people were clearly wondering, what is he doing here? About a week after we'd move in, we went to Echo Creek's elementary school to have a chat with the principal. Thankfully, the process of getting her enrolled wasn't all too complicated. Iris seemed a bit nervous. Of course, she had been going to school prior to this, but I had already made it clear to her that it wouldn't be like the other times. She would have the opportunity to actually get to know people instead of wondering when and where our next move was going to be. I was determined to make this work. Once all the paperwork was settled and Iris was officially enrolled, we both stepped out of the school to leave. We had to go shopping for books and other school supplies. I was so deep in thought that I almost didn't notice the man that walked past us and into the school. Almost. My attention was called to him when I saw Iris turn her head to stare at him, through the corner of my eye. Naturally, I turned to see what she was looking at. I saw a tall, dark-haired man walking into the building. While I could clearly make out that he had an athletic build, his back was to us. It wasn't until he stopped near the entrance to turn and talk to a teacher that I saw what had actually caught Iris's attention. In my years of traveling the world, I had met models, movie stars, and a variety of celebrities, all very attractive people, of course, but I was certain that this was the most beautiful man I had ever laid eyes on. Just his side profile was absolutely striking. Even from where I stood, I could make out a gently curved nose, a sharp jaw, and full lips. The other teacher walked off. Apparently, the conversation was over, but as if he could sense my presence, he turned his head and made eye contact with me. I had to stop my jaw from dropping. Barely hidden behind a pair of round glasses, there was the most beautiful eyes I had ever seen. What was a man like this doing in a hick town like this? I must have had some sort of surprised expression on my face, because he raised one perfectly shaped eyebrow at me, as if to say, "Yes, may I help you?" Then his expression became puzzled, as he probably realized he didn't recognize me. Then he looked down and saw that I had a child with me. His lips formed a surprised O shape. Then he began walking over, and I experienced the type of nervousness I was sure teenage boys experience when their crush breathes in their direction. "Hello, sir," he greeted me. His voice was soft and clipped, professional. "Do you need help with anything?" My mind yelled at me, "Say something." "Oh, hello. Not really," I managed to say, smiling at him. "I've just moved in and my daughter here well, we had her enrolled here." "Ah," he looked slightly surprised, like everyone else had, but he soon directed his gaze down to my daughter. She was 7 and thus had considerably less experience in life than I did, so she had also never seen a face like his, probably. Naturally, she was a little shy when he bent over slightly to talk to her. I got the pleasure of seeing his frosty expression change into a warm smile. Again, I felt that flutter of nervousness. "Hey there," he said, his voice gentle. "What's your name? You excited to start school here?" Iris pressed a little closer to me, but she answered in a quiet voice. "Yeah, my name is Iris." He smiled even wider. "Great to meet you, Iris. I'm Mr. Holland. I teach math. I'm looking forward to seeing more of you." He stood up straight as he looked at me again. His face reset into that neutral, icy expression. "It was nice meeting you, sir," he says, before turning and strolling back into the building. I stood there for a good 30 seconds before I turned and stiffly led Iris back to our car. Now, to address the obvious elephant in the room. I had an experimental phase in high school. That is to say, I kissed many girls and just a handful of boys. I'd always known my attraction to men was there, but it had never been an attraction that I'd paid much attention to. If you asked me if I was bisexual, I would probably say yes, but it wasn't something you'd know unless you asked. I had always just assumed I had a very heavy lean towards women, which was probably still true, but there was no denying the jolt seeing his face had given my system. I was curious about him. I thought about him during the drive back home. Was he married? Surely he had to be. In a small town like this where everyone clearly knew everyone, I couldn't imagine that no one had managed to cuff him. But I couldn't recall seeing a ring on his finger. Not that I'd been paying much attention to his hands. Mr. Holland. What was his first name? I tried to shake him out of my memory. Attractive as he was, I didn't think it would do me any good to get too fixated on him. After all, I'd just gotten out of a marriage. However, loveless it had been in the end. Iris was still getting used to being away from her mother, and that was under the assumption that romantically pursuing a most likely heterosexual man in a small town would somehow not be a terrible idea. Still, all of that aside, surely it wouldn't hurt to try and be his friend, would it? I let this idea stew in my head for a bit. Iris started school the next day. I ran my company primarily from home. There would be times I'd have to take trips. That couldn't be helped, unfortunately. But they would be few and far between. When the school day was about over, I went to pick her up. I spotted her little blonde head easily in the crowd of students pouring out of the school. She spotted my car and ran over, opening the door to the back seat and climbing into the back seat. "Hey there, sweetheart," I said as I began to drive us home. "How was your first day?" "It was all right," she said, turning to stare out the rear window and watch the school get farther and farther away. "Anyone give you trouble?" I asked, trying not to sound too worried. "Students, teachers? No, not at all. The teachers were all really nice," Iris said with a smile as she sat down properly again. "Especially Mr. Holland." My finger tapped against the steering wheel. "Mr. Holland," I repeated, as if the name hadn't been a semi-constant presence in my mind for the past several hours. "Math teacher?" "Yeah, he's cool. She gave a little laugh. Everyone talks about him. He doesn't have a wife or girlfriend or anything, even though he's so nice and looks like a supermodel. My brows raised in a slight surprise. So he was single. That was very strange, indeed. Was he just younger than I had assumed? Later that evening, I had a chat with another neighbor while we were both out wandering our lawn. He and I talked about Iris starting school. In the middle of our conversation, I realized that I might be able to get some information about this teacher. I brought up her math teacher as casually as I could, and as luck would have it, "Oh, you mean Paige," he snorted. "Yeah, he's nice to all the kids. Real good teacher, that one," he said with a dry chuckle. Jackpot. You say that like it's a bad thing, I pointed out. Jim rolled his eyes slightly. It's not, but Paige Holland is a bit of an odd one. Young, handsome guy. Great with kids and animals. But he hates just about everyone else. Lives on his own and has rejected pretty much every single woman in town. I recalled his decisively unfriendly tone and expression. He hadn't even asked for my name. Huh. Any idea why that could be? I asked, hoping I didn't sound too nosy. Jim shrugged. Beats me. We all grew up in this town. As a kid, he had been a bit more pleasant, but by the time he hit his teens, he changed. We called him the Ice Prince in high school. He's going to be single forever at this rate. Maybe that's what he wants. After that, we chatted about a few other things before telling each other goodnight. But now I was really curious about Mr. Holland. Or, well, Paige, apparently. One fateful Friday night, about 2 months after we'd made the move, I finally saw Paige out in town. The rain was coming down hard that night, when I had driven out and stepped into the grocery store. The sky had barely been gray, but by the time I was getting my items checked out, the rain was heavy and almost violent. It sucked to not have a car on a night like this, I thought to myself, as I stepped outside. I was about to book it to my car when I spotted someone standing in front of the store for shelter, hands full of groceries. I turned my head. Standing beside me was none other than Mr. Paige Holland, staring at the sky like it had personally offended him. My stomach did a flip in surprise. "Oh, hey there," I greeted. Paige turned his head to look at me. "Mr. Manson," he responded. I couldn't help but grin. "Oh, you remember me." He turned his head and went back to staring at the pouring rain. "You're Iris's father, aren't you?" "We've met. Of course I remember you." "Right." He didn't say anything else. Geez, I thought he's colder than the rain. Ah, the rain. Was he stranded? "Do you need a ride?" I asked after a few seconds. Paige turned to look at me again with a questioning arch of his eyebrow. I smiled and nodded toward my car. "I could drop you off. The rain doesn't look like it'll let up anytime soon. It'd be better than just standing here waiting around." Paige pursed his lips slightly. He brought his hand up to look at his watch before giving a soft sigh. "I suppose there's no reason to decline," he finally conceded. And so the both of us ducked into the rain and jogged over to my car. I thankfully hadn't parked too far away. We arranged our groceries in the back seat before I moved to the driver's seat and Paige sat beside me. As I buckled my seatbelt, Paige took his glasses off to wipe the droplets of water off them with the hem of his shirt. He was somehow even more handsome with his glasses off, even though taking them off revealed a small horizontal scar right above his cheek. I quickly looked away before it became obvious I was staring. The drive was silent, mostly. I tried to make small talk. "So, teaching, what's that like?" "I enjoy it." "Great to hear." "I actually run a company." "I know that. You're all over the social media. My mother uses your website for her online shopping." "That's great." So he'd recognized me the moment he saw me, and just hadn't cared who I was. That was certainly new. I wasn't so well known that people recognized me everywhere, but when they did, they usually had some sort of reaction. Being in this town was making me realize I was used to people liking me, or at least pretending to like me, and this interaction with Paige was the height of that so far. Why was he so unfriendly? Eventually, we reached his house. It was small, but it seemed like just enough for one person. Thanking me, he stepped out of the car. The rain was still going, so I stepped out as well to help him with some of his stuff. "Thank you, but I've got it," he was saying. He was about to continue declining my help when he missed a step and his foot slipped against the wet ground. Oh, crap. Thinking fast, I reached and grabbed him by the wrist, stopping him from falling on his face. Then I pulled him back so he was standing properly. He was taller than I was by a few inches, but frequent exercise made pulling him up not much of a problem. "See, this is why we accept help from other people," I said. He looked a bit dazed, his glasses askew. I reached out to straighten them up. You could have broken your nose just now, I continued. It was dark, his face just barely illuminated by a nearby street lamp, yet I was able to see the redness that flushed his cheeks. It was only when he stepped back that I realized we'd been standing a bit closer to each other than normal. Right, thank you, he mumbled, hurriedly getting the rest of his stuff from my car and rushing into his house. I watched him curiously before getting back into my car and continuing to drive home. Jim's words played back in my head. Ah, I said to myself, could it be? When I got back, I apologized to Iris for getting back late. She was more than a little disappointed when I explained that I'd met her teacher at the store. Now I wish I went with you. I want to see Mr. Holland outside of class. What did his house look like? She asked me as we put away the groceries together in the kitchen. I chuckled. The fondness she had for her math teacher wasn't something she hid. It showed in the way she talked about him and her grades. She was about to ask another question when something in one of the plastic bags caught her eye. She made a sound of confusion as she pulled out a large bottle of face moisturizer. What the heck is this? She asked, holding it out to me. I took it from her just as confused. That's a good question. Pretty sure I didn't buy this. Oh, I stopped speaking as I recalled how quickly Paige had rushed into his house. It would be natural for him to forget something. Smiling to myself, I decided I'd pay him a visit next morning. You know, just to return his lost property. Hope you don't mind me just showing up. I would have given you a call first, but I don't have your phone number, haha. I smiled at Paige, who had just the door slightly open and was eyeing me warily. It was the next morning, a Saturday, so I assumed he wasn't too happy to have his morning interrupted. He was still in pajamas. Had I woken him up? Then I held up the bottle of moisturizer. His eyes went wide. I didn't even notice that was missing, he muttered as he reached out to take it from me. Thank you. You're very welcome, I hummed in response. Now was my chance, I thought. Say, Mr. Holland, now that I'm here, there's something I've been meaning to ask you about, I started. He tilted his head curiously. I took that as a sign to continue. Iris has always had problems with math. Do you mind giving her a little extra help? Of course not. She's my student, he responded immediately. It was like I could visibly see him switch into teacher mode. Any idea what might help her the best? I shrugged. I have a few ideas, but I can't talk for long. She'll be up soon, so I need to get back. Is it alright if I got your phone number? I asked. I watched him narrow his eyes just slightly in suspicion. Had he seen through my plans? I mean, I did want to talk to him about Iris, but I also wanted to be able to contact him more frequently. If he did see through me, he didn't say so. We exchanged phone numbers. I started to become a more frequent presence in Paige's life after that day. I would text and call him occasionally to know how Iris was doing. It took a bit of this before he let me start calling him Paige instead of Mr. Holland. I messaged, "It just feels so formal, don't you think?" And he archly replied, "Well, we are having formal discussions, aren't we, Mr. Manson?" Upon reading this message, I couldn't help but laugh to himself. He really didn't want anyone to get closer to him, did he? I was determined to get through to him. We saw each other at the store semi-frequently, and each time I'd drop him off at his home. He would always complain and insist that it wasn't necessary, but I always ended up dropping him off anyway. One afternoon, I finally managed to make a crack in his defenses. As I drove him home, "Will you really not let me call you by your first name, Mr. Holland?" I glanced at him through the mirror, just in time to watch him roll his eyes. "Again with that?" he sighed. "Well, seeing as you've turned yourself into my chauffeur, I suppose it's only natural. Feel free to call me Paige." "I don't understand why you want to so badly, though," he continued. "Well, Paige is such a nice name," I said. "It suits you. Not calling you that feels like a waste." He looked surprised before rolling his eyes with a quiet scoff. But he made no more complaints, and after that moment, he only called me Frederick. The weeks passed, and I noticed he really didn't care about my status as a person, nor was he very impressed by how much I traveled, even though he had never done such traveling himself. It really was a new experience for me, but not one I hated. It was only when I was able to separate my identity as Frederick Manson, charismatic CEO, from my identity as Frederick Manson, new resident of Echo Creek, and father of Iris Manson, that our conversations became more organic. And in learning to do this, I started making friends with the other residents as well. Paige and I were on more casual terms at that point, but I found I wanted to get even closer to him than that. I could tell my fascination with him was more than just platonic, and despite his best efforts to seem cold, I could tell that he didn't dislike me, but he was clearly still shutting me out. I decided to be more direct. You know, I started as I drove him home one afternoon. I'd really like to actually be your friend. He stared at me in surprise. What? I mean, come on. We've been hanging out like this for a few weeks now. What's the harm? You seem like an interesting guy. I looked at him through the corner of my eye. He had a slightly apprehensive expression on his face, like he didn't believe me. Really? You think I'm interesting? He said. Quite. But do you think I'm lying? I asked. Paige huffed. Well, no. I just figured someone must have told you about me. I've heard a few things, I admitted, but I want to get to know you myself. Is there anything wrong with that? He turned his head away from me to look out the window. When he answered me, his voice was calm, but the redness of his ears betrayed him. I guess not, but you'll be disappointed. I'm rather boring, he said quietly. I smiled. I'll be the judge of that. What an odd game I was playing. Of course, I was more than aware of the romantic undertone of our conversation. And yes, I had told myself that I just wanted to befriend Paige, but things were getting a little more complicated than that. For one thing, it was becoming more obvious that Paige felt some kind of attraction towards me, which is how I was slowly figuring out why he was so closed off to other people. But I wouldn't get a proper answer until much later. Starting from that day, we became proper friends. We would meet to hang out 1 or 2 times a week. And what an odd sight we were to Echo Creek's residents. The strange new outsider and the town's loner. Friends? We were the subject of gossip for quite a bit. I didn't mind, but it made Paige visibly uncomfortable at times. As for Iris, she was thrilled to be able to spend time with their favorite outside of school. Sometimes the 3 of us would go out together. She always had the most fun then. It was after one of these outings, the movies, that she made a statement that made me start to think deeper about my friendship with Paige. I was tucking her into bed when she smiled sleepily and asked, "Can we do that more? Today was so much fun." "Of course we can, sweetheart. I'll talk to him about it." I kissed her on the forehead. "Thanks, Dad." She turned onto her side, and as she started to fall asleep, she mumbled softly, "It's weird. I never had this much fun when we went out with Mom." I froze. She was already fast asleep, but I stared at her face for a few more seconds. Then I got up and walked out of the room, deep in thought. Had that been some kind of sign? I thought for several minutes, before giving up. Children just said things like that sometimes, you know? I thought it might not be wise to look into it too deeply. I decided to give Paige a call to thank him for making the day so enjoyable for Iris. When he picked up the phone, however, he sounded freaked out. "Frederick, I was just about to call you," he said, his voice tense. "I had fun today, however. I've thought about it, and I don't think it's appropriate for me to be friends with my student's father in this way. Please don't contact me anymore, unless it has to do with Iris' schooling. Goodbye." And he hung up. I stared at the phone in disbelief. What the hell? I tried calling him back, but he didn't pick up. Frustrated, I pulled on a pair of pants and grabbed my car keys. 10 minutes later, I was in front of Paige's door. I rang the doorbell when he answered. All the anger I felt was washed away immediately. Paige looked deeply disturbed, his eyes red like he'd been crying. "Why are you here?" His voice was thick as he glared at me. "Didn't you hear what I said over the phone?" I sighed. "Yes, but a decision like that usually comes with more of an explanation, you know." My voice softened. "Paige, talk to me. What's wrong?" Paige bit against his knuckle nervously. He looked like he was heavily burdened by something, and as he stepped aside to let me enter the house, I knew he was about to confess something to me. That night, Paige explained everything to me. "Look," he started as he paced back and forth in front of me. I was seated on the couch, watching him in concern. "Look, I'll just be honest with you. I like you, I think. I haven't really felt like this about anyone before. At least not for a while." The swell of happiness I felt in my chest was short-lived as Paige brought his thumb up to his mouth, chewing on the nail. I'd never seen him this nervous before. "So what's wrong with that?" I asked him. "I feel the same way about you, if that wasn't already super obvious." He smiled weakly. It was. He stared at me like I had 2 heads the first time we met. His smile fell. "But we can't do anything about that," I frowned. "Why not?" He went back to chewing on his nail. "Because they'll hate me, I'm pretty sure." He glanced at me, and after seeing the shocked look on my face, he added, "My parents." He'd hardly brought up his parents up before, and I never really asked. I just knew they had all moved out of Echoes Creek when Paige went to college, and that he moved back on his own when he got his degree, so he could start teaching in his hometown. "People always talk about how I randomly started shutting people out," he said, "but it really wasn't random, you know." He took off his glasses, making that scar of his more noticeable. "When I was 14, I developed a crush on a boy in my class. That was how I knew that that I'm gay. They found out. I think I wrote it in a diary or something. I don't remember. All I remember was that they lost it. My dad gave me this scar. I didn't know when I got up to confront him. Probably around the same time I noticed his eyes growing misty with tears. I just stayed away from people after that. I was terrified of anyone finding out. And my folks just pretended all that had never happened, he mumbled, putting his glasses back on to hide his tears. My neighbor made a joke just now as I got home. He saw us and Iris today, so he made a joke about how we looked like a couple and their kid. And I just freaked out. I don't want my folks finding out about this, so I just got scared. That explained the hasty phone call. I was quiet as I pulled him into a firm hug. He held on to me, resting his chin against my shoulder. But I really do like you, Frederick, he mumbled. I sighed and rubbed a hand over the back of his neck. I don't want to put pressure on you, Paige. But what do you want me to do? Do you want me to leave? I will leave you if you want me to. We were still hugging, so I could feel the exact moment his arms tightened around me. No, he replied. Then it gets scarier. He was almost like a child in this moment, doubtful but curious. Things get scarier when you don't confront them, I replied, though a little sagely. I like you too, you know. I pulled back and held him at arm's length. I know things seem overwhelming right now, and they will remain so for the time being. But unless you face them, they'll stay like that for your whole life. I do not know how life's going to treat this relationship, but trying wouldn't hurt. I rubbed a hand in his hair. So, will you go right now? All right. I rubbed his cheeks and wiped away his tears. You can take your time and tell me how you feel about that. Call me. Message me. I will be there. Just let me know. What if I don't want to do this thing between us? That put a little weight on my chest, and I was sure my daughter was going to feel that too. Even if she probably hadn't wondered about us being close like this, I was sure she was wise enough to notice any awkwardness between her dad and her favorite teacher. Then we will stop it, I said resolutely. He swallowed and nodded. He rubbed a hand over his eyes and then asked me to leave. Tomorrow's school. I have to go to sleep. Yeah, sure. I stepped back. Good night, Paige. Good night, he replied, and locked the door after me. When I laid down on the bed that night, I didn't know what the new morning was going to bring to me. I knew it was either going to make my daughter happy or insanely sad. I ardently hoped for the former. Thankfully, my prayers were heard. The next morning, I woke up with a text from Paige, and it read, simple as it was, the next date's on me. Well, at least now I had something new to build and work upon. A relationship with a shy math teacher. Conclusion. The conversation we had that night was, I thought, the real starting point of our relationship. We continued to be friends to everyone else, even as our relationship secretly became more romantic. After several months of this, though, we went public with our relationship. This sent ripples through the town that inevitably reached Paige's parents, who were furious. But even through all that, we stayed by each other's side. Till now, they still don't approve of our relationship, but an uneasy peace reigns for now. We can only hope that they'll come around someday. As for Iris? Well, we had to come clean to her eventually. We sat her down about a year after we officially started dating and explained everything to her. Thankfully, this conversation went a lot better than the one with Paige's parents had gone. She had been a bit confused, mostly because she had not known at all that I liked men. But that conversation was promptly replaced by excitement. After all, this meant that her favorite teacher would be a constant presence in her life. The end. What do you think of teachers dating their students' single parents? Let us know in the comments down below. Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing to become part of our Rainbow Force and stay wholesome.